Thank you all for being here. As Mike Richardson was saying before, please feel free to ask questions, whether on a chat. There's a little chat that you can use here if you look at the bottom, or just opening your microphone and just saying that. Feel free. Of course, if the question is related with something I'm showing or talking about right at the moment, I'm saying otherwise at the end of the session. I think the session was going to be 6 hours enough with the break in between, didn't we say? I'm kidding. No, it's just about an hour. Don't worry. It's something very informal. I just, at the beginning of the pandemic, as the tour operator basically went to a full stop because 90% of our tours are to Italy, and Italy was hit first. Of course, I started to develop these virtual tours, and mostly as a way to connect with people, because that's what we miss when we travel. But travel is also the fundamental way of learning. And that was one of the fundamental reasons why Frederick Law Olmsted came this side of the pond to visit and explore and learn. And this is what we call the Grand Tour. The Grand Tour was a British invention, basically, in the 16th, 17th century. The British nobles and landry, they basically travel all over France and down to Italy to visit, the ruins of ancient Rome, the masterpieces of the Renaissance, and everything that they believe was part to complete their education. It took some. It took some 2 years in the Grand Tour times, but now, of course, most people do it. Students might do it in a semester, but adults don't usually do it in a few weeks. Now, I'm about to share my screen. I just have to be sure I got the right screen on. And here we go. You might recognize the gentleman here as how I see describe himself, an American farmer visiting England. So Frederick Law Olmsted did travel by boat from New York. He was originally from Staten Island. If I am not correct, please correct me. And basically he arrived in Liverpool in 1850. So about 170 years ago. And at that time, England was really changing a lot, as of course was the US. And there were still great differences between, of course, the United Kingdom and the United States. And Olmsted left a travel journal of his trips, the walks of an American farmer in England. So that's firsthand information about the places that he visited. So just to tell you what this is going to be about, starting from his Olmsted trip to England, and he did mostly travel across the area around Liverpool, Northern England, and North Wales. I've been living for 8 years now, right in between Birkenhead and Castle. So I'm half an hour, and they're opposite ways, half an hour each way. Castle is the place where I go and play, take the kids to play. Basically, it's now an open park. So I will describe the experience and what are these two important and opposite kind of parks that Olmsted had the chance to visit and take inspiration in different ways from. But I would like to explain where the idea of the public park came from, and it's actually where rooted. Guess where? Well, of course, the ancient Romans, because everything good comes from the Romans, not just because I'm a Roman, but it's true that some cultural elements of the parks, of course, transformed, that changed over the centuries. It came down from ancient Rome through the Renaissance, and then eventually to the 18th and 19th century England to be. Of course, they had different purposes, but the basic ideas, they are not that far from the ideas that Olmsted had. The fact that the park is not just a place where, go for a jog or go outside and having a barbecue or smoking, but it's actually one of the elements that shapes the souls and the culture and the identity of a nation by shaping the identity of their citizens. And he actually saw that there. So everything that arrived there is the result of centuries of history. Now, this is how Liverpool Harbour looked like in 1850 when Olmsted arrived. It was in the Industrial Revolution in England started between Manchester and Liverpool with the canals and the harbour. Liverpool Harbour was also one of the largest emigration points towards the US. For instance, it was the place from which the Titanic left in the beginning of the 20th century. And and was also a large commercial harbor still then. Sadly, it was connected also with the slave trade, but by the time of Olmsted, the slave trade has ended in the United Kingdom. It was already ended decades before. And this is the Royal Albert Docks today. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, because this was the very first industrial sailors and docks that were built in the world. They were built at the beginning of the 1800s and 1830s, and they were basically abandoned during most of the 20th century, only to be restored some 20 years ago. My office is actually in there now, because now there are museums. There's a Tate Modern, there's a slavery museum, there's a maritime museum, there's a number of cultural institutions, and so we're also based there in a business center. So it's very, very interesting. And that building was already there, was in use with cranes. It was the first industrial docking area where basically the ships could load and unload vast amounts of goods in half the time compared to the average time of doing those operations back then. So it was something really interesting to see. The person who inspired most Olmsted was the architect and the gardener, the designer basically of Birkenhead Park. Now I'll show you. I'll be using different medias, using some videos. I'll be using Google Maps a little bit. And so this is Liverpool. I know the River Mersey, which is the river on the estuary of which there is Liverpool, doesn't look great. It's a very wide, very low, and it has a very dark tone. Anyway, this is the Irish Sea, basically. So that little island there is Isle Man. And then this is Ireland. And then, so the spot here is Northern Ireland. One mistake never to do while you're traveling to Ireland, to Europe, never call Ireland Southern Ireland, because they really don't like it. So Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom, Ireland, which has been independent for 100 years now. Anyway, so you can see Liverpool is just here between North Wales, which is this part here, and this is the Wales, one of the four nations making the United Kingdom, and then Liverpool here. Now Liverpool, if you ever visit today, there's also cruises that go there. It's got an international airport, although from the US you might have to fly to Manchester. It has a beautiful waterfront. It went in about 15 years ago, was the World Europe culture capital. There is this kind of funding that the European Union had to, develop cities that were hosting yearly festivals, and so they got the chance to redevelop entirely the mostly in abandoned harbor and to transform it. And there's a number of museums. It's really, really nice. There's a vibrant city, and of course is the city of the Beatles. So everybody knows that most Beatles fans must go there. Anyway, just opposite the river Mersey, where basically its calm waters is ideal for harboring, it's quite wide. There is, of course, Birkenhead, which was at that time mostly marshy lands. So, and by the beginning of the 1800s, there was basically a kind of there were a number of political reforms. In 1834, the British Parliament passed a bill that allowed more people to vote. The right to vote was extended. At that time, about 1 in every 6 males, adult male, were entitled to vote for the Parliament, and it was more than it was basically before the reform. And it was mostly based on the financial status and the properties that people had. But in 1834, the reform allowed more and more people, even people which are just renting a property and weren't landowners, to vote. So that was another step towards the democratization of the British society, although on the other hand, it was also quite a step back, because the first time that explicitly women were barred from voting. It said for the first time that only men were allowed to vote. This, of course, until the beginning of 20th century. Anyway, today Birkenhead Park, which is just, as I said, opposite to Liverpool, it's on this strip of land called the Wirral, right here, and it belongs administratively to that, although it was at that time connected with Chester, which is a Roman Roman city. I live about 15 minutes from Chester. It's a wonderful Roman city. It was created in the first century AD by the Romans, where they, I don't like saying invaded, they brought civilization to the Britain through the British Isles. Let's say that. And then you can see now Birkenhead it has a large harbor as well, which is mostly abandoned, and now it's also under a project of regeneration. But of course, it's an area densely populated. Anyway, at that time, as I said, this part was just marshy areas and was, by a special law of the British Parliament in between 1830s and 1840s, that for the very first time in the UK, and probably it was one of the very first time in Europe, that a government, a local council funded park was open, and this was what gave the idea and was basically inspired Olmsted to push in the project for the creation of Central Park, and of course all the other parks as a something that is not just a part of a decoration or just a part of city planning, but as a deep and important cultural aspect and political aspect that we are about to see. As I said, Olmsted was interested a lot in the social aspects, including also slavery, for example. So it was really, I think it's a really important figure of the 19th century, very inspiring, especially in these times today. Anyway, I will talk about the Birkenhead Park and its features at the end, because to understand it fully and how it came to be, I like to see what were the origins of that. First of all, who was Sir Joseph Paxton? He was educated in London in the Kew Gardens at the very beginning of the around 1820s, 1830s. That's when he was born in 1803. That's when the very they started the modern scientific botanics and scientific gardening. It wasn't just about designing and grooming the landscape. It was actually making experiments. He developed, for example, greenhouses and a number of other breeds. This is the Chatsworth House. Was a stately home, a large mansion typical of England. It was established, you see, it's a large Palladian building. Palladio was this Renaissance Venetian architect who created these wonderful villas. And later on in the 16th, 17th, 18th century, most villas in Europe, in Northern Europe especially, and also North America, were designed after the ideas of Palladio. And it had large grounds with large gardens, which changed a lot. And Paxton was there working for the owner at the time, which was William Spencer Cavendish, and the Lord of Devonshire. He was basically the man who is connected with the most famous and available, commercially available bananas. So all the bananas in the world, or 90% of the bananas in the world, they're all grown from one single plant, which was created by Paxton for Cavendish. In fact, it's called the Cavendish banana, and is now has got some problems because, of course, because all the plants of banana, or most of the plants of banana in the world, they are basically copies, perfect genetic copies of these ones, because they were made with the roots rather than with seeds. They actually are also threatened by diseases. Anyway, this was I think this was a fun fact about Paxton being connected with something like a banana. And this is a Cavendish, who was basically, he inherited at a very young age in his 20s and 30s, and he spent a lot of money, as only money that you actually won or inherited can be spent. That hard-earned money, they're not that can spend that easily, to the point that he nearly bankrupted his family. He left a large amount of debts when he died. So eventually they had to sell most of the product. It's not the Chadwick, which are only sold later on. And of course, now it's in the last 30 or 40 years, it's become a public park. Only later on in 1847, Paxton design the first publicly funded gardens, Birkenhead Park. And you could see that the design was very different, very unique compared to what the former gardens in the villas and in the noble houses were before. Although it has some feature that some of the English gardens already had in the 18th century, the overall concept, the overall design, it's completely new. And I just wanted to show you this engravings because it has all the winding roads, and then those were the project. Just a couple were built, not all of them, of greenhouses. Actually, Birkenhead Park had the largest greenhouse, which was basically the model for the Crystal Palace done in London at the end of the 19th century for the World Exhibition. And greenhouses were just at the beginning there. So he was basically a really great innovator of that, because of course there he could grow exotic plants. He grew the largest lilies and made them flowering, which is something that nobody else had done before. So he had really a scientific approach to that and really achieved a number of things. The original greenhouse that was done in Birkenhead Park doesn't exist anymore. This is because they were heated with coal, and during the First World War it was forbidden to use coal for any other use but for households. So basically all the plants died off, and then it was abandoned for several years. So basically in 1920 was knocked down, never to be rebuilt. So there is no there's only the projects, and we know the features. Some of the features were that he had custom made larger glass panels compared to the panels that normally were built there. The largest glass panels there was an average about 3 feet long. He had some panels made 4 feet long, so you could use a lighter and a leaner frame. But was that the first park where people was one of the things that Olmsted really appreciated about the park when he visited. He saw people of different social levels, the noble, the poor, the servants, the people dressed in a very rough way and people very elegant, sitting next to each other and talking to each other. There was no division. People could just mingle together. Was that the first case? No, it wasn't. We know that in London, in the Vauxhall Gardens, which do not exist anymore, now it's all built up and it's all there was a park. This is one of the models. I have a few other illustration that was for sure. It existed at the beginning of the 1700s, but it probably did. The first bulk of it was already there as early as 1660s, because there are some description of open gardens there. The gardens were privately owned. So, but we're open to the public in the sense of paying a ticket or buying a ticket for an attraction. You can actually go there. And you can see it consisted of many walkways with, of course, gardens and different buildings where there were a number of activities and concerts. Most notably, right at the center of these gardens, in the 18th century, the statue of Handel, Georg Handel, the famous German musician that moved to Britain and basically became a Briton at during the 18th century, was right there in these gardens. And it was also the place where he was able to play his music in honor of the King George III, which was also a German born. So the British didn't really like much having a foreign king, especially a German, and also they didn't like Handel because of his heavy German accent. Although he became a British subject, he got British citizens, and of course it became basically, if not just a Briton, he became one of the most British musicians. And he had different features. He played. He had different opera companies that eventually financially broke. But one concert, it became very popular also as a composer of religious music, like the Messiah by Handel is the one of the most famous composition, because he also wrote music that was played for a large public in the garden. So the gardens weren't just a place for a stroll or to talk, or you just to enjoy the spaces and the views and just being outdoors, but was a place where there were shows, there were concerts, there was a number of activities. And in these peculiar gardens, people of different social levels, they could just mix together and mingle. And this drove the first criticism, especially during the end of the 18th century. This is before, considered also before the French Revolution. But this was the very beginning of what Olmsted saw as really something that could reshape and could open the ways to democracy, to the participation, to equality of every single citizen in their society. And if you could see that in a kingdom, then imagine what could be achieved in America with the of course with a republican system in place. So just play the first 25 minutes of this conversation. No, I'm kidding. I just 1 or 2 minutes. But I want you to just kind of try to immerse in the in the in the in the time of the 18th century, when already music was a type of, I have to change the slide now. When you put by videos 3, okay. And so this is one of the many illustrations that we have of the gardens. So you can see the gardens, in this case, the Vauxhall Gardens in London, they had a pretty basic, basically design, although there were different pavilions. There was a concert pavilion, there were different walkways and passageways, and of course mostly was a kind of forestry. Consider that since the Middle Ages, the British countryside had basically a number of castles and homes which were surrounded by forestry, mostly for game, for hunting, and for the purpose of the nobles living there, and of course open fields for farming. But the early gardens were basically only made starting from the 15th, 16th century. And I will also go there. Instead of going chronologically, I'm just going backwards. I think it's more interesting. So you could see here, they were busy. There were people strolling and chatting, although they all dressed quite nicely in this etching. There were, we know, because there are many written documentation, and also a lot of complaints of people that saw mixing social classes as a threatening to the natural or divine order of society. Consider that in Europe in the 18th, 17th century, they thought that was basically the birthright was something that God had chosen for you. If you were born rich and wealthy, well, you have done something, you were deserved to good. If you were born poor or miserable for some reason, well, basically that was your destiny. And so, of course, it took a few hundred years and few revolutions to change that mentality. And so there were also mimers, dancers, musicians, and there was a number of entertainment, which was, you had still to pay a ticket, but was available for most social levels. Now, the history, this is the Palace of Versailles in France. The history of gardens arrived, the idea of public gardens, of course, arrived in England from continental Europe, but arrived not as a public garden, but as a state garden, most notably the French gardens. Now, the modern concept of gardens, or a place that is man-made, and a natural space that is designed by man, so is man-made but looks somehow natural and has a number of plants and features, was something that originated in Renaissance Italy and was basically rooted in the ancient Roman culture, as I will explain. But they arrived in England mostly as also a status symbol, and a kind of something that was almost expected from people of a certain ranks. And then later on, as I said, towards the end of 17th century, maybe 18th century, it became also available to the public. So these gardens, which were privately owned and privately built, they started to be open to the public for a fee initially, but also in some occasions for free, because the public enjoyed them so much and enjoyed was what was happening here. The transformation from a small private garden to a large state garden to a large park, it happened in France towards the end of 16th century already, with the first palaces and villas built in the 16th century, and then definitely around in the beginning of the 17th century, in the beginning of 1600s, with the castle of Versailles, the Palace of Versailles, which was just in the outskirts of Paris, built by Louis XIV, which I don't know if you heard that there's a museum in France that decided to change the Roman numerals and use the Arab numbers instead, which because said most people do not understand the Roman numbers, which I believe visiting the museums should challenge what you already know. If everything that is there is something that you already know, maybe you don't need the museum then, because a museum is supposed to challenge you a little bit so you learn more, because it stimulates your curiosity. Anyway, as you can see, the gardens are really vast, and they have a number of features, geometrical shapes, ponds, fountains, different type of theaters, arenas, statues. There's a large display, and that correspond, of course, to the image of the king's son, Louis XIV, which, of course, is a symbol and an image of power, of wealth. So it reflects that. And, of course, was also a place where to stroll, to do a number of sports. Consider that the nobles, the ruling class at that time, especially the kings, they were involved in a lot of things, but not in politics, not in decision. That was the head of the government, because if anything got wrong, then he could blame the ministers of the government. So the king, kept his power. It was only later on with the French Revolution that then they blamed the king, but that was a safety measure, so that the king cannot be blamed for any mistake. And many kings, they didn't even have a political educational background. They just enjoyed their time playing, parties, dinners. They, of course, represent the greatness of a state rather than something like that head of an operative, a head of a government. And the gardens were also a place for the king's affairs and a number of other indulging in a number of other pleasures. Now and today, it's basically a tourist attraction where people go and see concerts and enjoy the park. But the idea of the park again is something that came again from afar, and it's something that it basically originated in Italy, but it was also could have been seen already, and Olmsted saw this type of gardens in England at that time. Actually, most gardens that were in England at the time were of this type: large display of course, elegance, style, but ultimately they reflected the power and the wealth of their owners, and that share with their guests. This is on a very cold winter morning in Chirk Castle. Now I'll show you on Google Maps where we are. And Chirk Castle, it's at that time where Olmsted visited it. It was, so this is the Merseyside. This is the River Mersey. This is the Wirral. This is the River Dee, which is the River Chester. It's the Roman city here. And then from here on, it starts North Wales. And Chirk is just here near Wrexham. Consider that North Wales had the first coal mines and metal mines that basically started the Industrial Revolution in Manchester, and a number of first railroads and number of canals to transport all that material there. So there's also that history there. So there it is. Of course, it's all closed now to COVID, but hopefully we're starting soon. And it's basically had large grounds. I will use a drone video soon so we can see it better, but just to give you an idea where it is located. And it's somehow, although the building, it's a castle built in the 13th century, so it's 800 years old, and inside it was refurbished in the Renaissance to be looking more like a mansion, so it's very luxurious. He was surrounded by some magnificent gardens with a large farming. Now, today, this is a National Trust property, so most of this stately homes and properties of land gentry, Many of them, thousands of them, were knocked down at the beginning of the 20th century. So many are gone because the owners couldn't afford them. There was a change in the economy, a change in taxation levels. Taxes were introduced on these properties. So lots of these families, which the people were for generation, they've never worked, so they didn't know how to work. So they didn't want. If they worked, they even lost money. So basically, they didn't have anything to support. So, but many others were basically acquired by the National Trust, which is an independent foundation, but it was at the beginning was government funded, and owns hundreds of historical buildings, palaces, gardens all over the United Kingdom. And the castle basically has large farm fields. Now we can't see the sheep. Consider that North Wales, Wales in general, has a total of about 3 million inhabitants. The UK has about 80 million, so it's a pretty not very busy place, not many people, and it's home to over 10 million sheep. So there's about more than 3 sheep per inhabitant. So most of the thing you see is sheep. In fact, I have to say, isolating here wasn't too bad because we already isolate naturally, so that you don't see many people. Anyway, you can see that these beautiful grounds are basically mostly grazing lands, and of course a water reservoir. Now this is there was a farming area which has been turned into visitor center, and the parking, and all the a cafeteria. Yes, if you ever visit the United Kingdom, the only downside of visiting these beautiful places, which are very beautifully run, efficiently run, is the food. Never ever buy food from their cafeterias because it's horrible. There's a couple of stale sandwiches. It's really terrible. I mean, that's really, so make sure you bring your nice food somewhere else because they're terrible. Anyway, the Olmsted visited the castle, which of course is beautiful, and then it has a number of former gardens. Now, the gardens where Olmsted visited were a little different because the topiary part, I have better pictures to show you the details, but just to show you where they are. This is basically the castle with the towers, and one side, this has been rebuilt because it in the 17th century was knocked down during the war between the royalists and the parliamentaries. So there were two factions, the supporters of the parliament, supporters of the king. So the castle was taken, and a wall basically was knocked down, but most of it is still preserved there. And the owners lived there until 30 or 40 years ago before it was then handed to the National Trust. The toppy area, said the formal garden parts here, it was only done after 1850, probably around 1870, I don't remember the year, but around the end of the 18th century. While the other part here, down here, with this kind of beautiful ditch, and then this part that goes in the forest part, this was done at the end of 1500. So it was pretty much like that. And especially the winding roads here, the fact that you can actually immerse yourself in a landscape that felt natural. This is one of the features that really fascinated Olmsted. So although his judgment was, how can all this beauty only be made for the purpose and the use of one only family and their guests? I mean, maybe the servants. Now let's have a look with the drone. I have to mute yes, there it is. You see the sheep, because in Wales everything's about sheep. Lamb or sheep. If you don't like lamb, that's not a nice place. Don't just keep it to yourself, because people can take it very, very personally. It's a beautiful place because it's lush, like Ireland, has a lot of history, castles, and beautiful language. Welsh, it's a Gaelic language. It's the same language that the people living here spoke before the Romans arrived. So it's nothing to do with English, nothing we could do with the Anglo-Saxon, and it is basically Celtic. So it's the language that most European tribes spoke before Julius Caesar and then the Romans conquered them. It's very hard, but it's very beautiful. And this is Church Castle. So you can see it's not very tall, but it's this very large towers covered with ivy or plants growing. The toppy area, this part here, was added, as I said, later. It's very beautiful. It's built on the top of a hill, as a castle would be, dominating area, and the valleys around are beautiful. So I have to say, when you drive up there and when you walk up there, it's really something that is like cleans your soul, and you cannot do anything bad for a day or two after you've been there. So that's when we had enough of the kids, we take them up there, and we let them strolling. And it's sad it's been, we haven't been able to go for the last 3 months, but we even go there in the winter because it's beautiful, although it's really cold. And I have some pictures to show you, because then this is now the surrounding parts with other ruins and stuff. There are also some Italian style gardens, which are the one. Okay. So this is the topiary with the castle with beautiful green park. This is the entrance. It's a grand entrance. It feels like it is a castle, but it also feels like a palace, with the large windows. Of course, the windows were a feature added later on with the, in the 16th century, when basically after the conquest of Wales. Now, Wales was independent country after the Roman left the Britain in the 6th century, 5th, 6th century AD. When the first invaders arrived, the British Romans asked to the Romans in Italy and Constantinople, send us help because we are swarmed by barbarians arriving, Vikings and other people. And the Romans said, we can't help you, we have our own troubles, because there were barbarians also in Southern Europe. So what happened is just basically England was abandoned in the 5th century, and Wales was independent for about 800 years. Between the 12 and 1300s, there was a war, and Edward I was the king who invaded and basically bought peace to, basically annexed Wales to England. And ever since then, ever since the 13th century, the heir to the English throne is the Prince of Wales, just to guarantee that there's a link between the two. That's why still today Charles is the Prince of Wales, is the title of this, so to also give importance to the Welsh and to the Welsh nation. And this castle, for example, also saw the last hero tried to rebel in the 1400s against the English, who was Llywyn, with the double L, Llywyn. It was basically the last leader who tried to revolt against the English, and of course he was defeated in the end. So Wales has not been independent. Today Wales has a number of degree of independence, is run as its own parliament, and has a number of deregulations. Anyway, this is the topiary, and you can see there's a number of different plants and shrubs, and this is one of the classic features of the English gardens, that has basically a very large and diverse planting. I'm speaking about not the hedge and the egg-shaped bushes, but the one beyond, and arranged in a way to look natural, even though they're man-made. So the key feature of English garden is it had to look natural, but it is entirely man-made and man-designed with species that probably won't even grow there naturally. And so it's very well groomed and very well attended. While the topiary, this kind of shaping the edges and the trees in creating monuments, sometimes statues, sometimes different figures, it's a feature that comes more from the Italian style gardens to the French gardens, which were basically adopted by the French garden. This idea that a garden should reflect entirely the human mastery in designing it, and should be designed in a geometrical way. This was already a feature of the gardens in Italy in the 15th century. For example, the Medici villas or the villas in Rome. I'll have one to show you as well. But basically, it became something philosophical in France in 1600s, especially with the ideas of French rationalism in the 1600s. René Descartes, the French philosopher, who Cartesio in Latin, who basically was the first one who developed a philosophical method, a scientific method of reasoning, and also of city planning, hence also a garden designing according to the Cartesian axis, the perpendicular shape, where everything should have a place and order in the space. So he had this also reflected a philosophical, a theological, and also a moral and political consequences. So it was all part of a grand plan that should be reflected in the architecture. Sorry, I'm going backwards. Let's see what else we have. And this is the church castle in the background. You can see there's also a statue. This is a 17th century copy of a Roman statue of Hercules, which is in the Archaeological Museum in Naples now. But then when the copy was done, this was still in Rome, in the Palazzo Farnese, and belonged to a Renaissance family, the Farnese family, and was originally discovered from the thermal baths of Caracalla, the Roman baths, where this statue were decorating. So again, everything goes back centuries and thousands of years in Europe. And this statue is a Renaissance feature of the former gardens which were created in the 1500s, which also fascinated. But the gardens, they had basically, there was a need to separate the former gardens here, the Renaissance garden with the bush, with the part that went over the other property, over the edge. And so there was a kind of a ditch that was created, but was disguised with the planting. And apparently this is one of the elements that really impressed Olmsted. The general feeling was about visiting the place that Olmsted had was, this is wrong. This should not be enjoyed only by one family. This should be for the benefit of all and should be open for all. And he was a prophet in that sense, because basically 100 years later, it was actually regularly open to the public. Now it's publicly owned. So he came and he foresaw an era to come. There's something very fascinating about the American travelers in the 19th century. The most famous is Mark Twain, An Innocent Abroad, because he saw a number of things that in America were already a reality that in Europe were not there yet, and said, oh, this must become. And for example, when Mark Twain visited Rome, he said, only in Europe you see a kingdom that spends more money in an army that has the sole purpose to keep their own people under control rather than a foreign enemy. and this was, the popular army of the situation in Rome at that time. And I think that this is really something really interesting, that America and the American intellectuals, which were forced to travel and understand Europe at the time, around 1850, 1860. I think Mark Twain came around the same time, 1870 maybe. It was basically, Mark Twain was already 52 or 50 in the 50s as well. It was basically the idea that, there were things that America had accomplished that are yet to come to Europe. So it's very interesting to see the cultural exchange between. And now this not very nice looking gentleman, looks quite grumpy. It's of course a Roman politician and philosopher and author. Is Cato, the elder of Cato the Censor. He was the man who defended the mos maiorum, the tradition of the fathers. Today you will describe him as a conservative, but his idea was rather to preserve the rights and the ideas of the Republic, who made Rome great. Now, when we think of ancient Rome, we always think of Rome as the empire, the emperors, the army, aggression, invade. But Rome for 500 years was a republic where people worked together for the good of all. And so Cato was one of the men who basically embraced that. He lived between the 3rd and 2nd century before Christ. He left many essays, many political activity. I'm only talking about basically this artwork, the Re Rustica or the Agricoltura, of farming and agriculture. This was written in the 3rd century BC. It's a farming handbook. It's not like a poem, like most people at that time were writing in verses. It's not a poem. The prose is just, saying you need to do this in order to achieve that. There's no, pompous phrases. There's no going around. It's just straight to the point. If you want this to grow, you need to do this and that. How to use animals on the farms, how to use workers, and a number of other things. So, and all this written by a very famous politician and a very famous author and philosopher, and had a very deep cultural influence, because farming, shaping the land, growing stuff, it wasn't about making something to survive. It was a philosophical activity that the Romans had the words to define, of a word that we don't have the equivalent, not in Italian, neither in English or in French or Spanish, which are the other two languages that I can communicate, and in any other language that I know for that. It's otium means something that you do not because you need to, but because you enjoy doing so and it's good to you. Something that basically it's opposite to officium, the duty, the office, what you do because it's your duty, whether it's a political duty, whether it's your work, or whether it's other duties that you have, of war duties, of civil duty. The otium is something that is productive, but not for basically for a practical need. It's something that's that is a deep spiritual and cultural part. And how does farming and landscaping for what is, because also in this and also in another Latin author about 150 years later, basically the Vitruvius, which is the author that was the main reference for Roman architecture, also it gives ideas of how to build gardens, where to build basically the country houses, which should build on a higher area, possibly on the top of a hill, like many villas are built on top of the hill, just because of Vitruvius, because he taught that you could dominate and enjoy the views, and that they knew the aesthetic importance and the philosophical importance of the views on landscaping of people. Now, this is just a sample drawing of how roughly a Roman villa would have been, with a courtyard, with a frescoed room, with a kitchen, with the servants' quarters, with the dining halls. But then at the back, there was always a garden. If you visit Pompeii, if you visit Roman villas, there was always a garden. The house had to communicate with the outdoors. And in Middle Age Europe, in the Renaissance, houses, castles were separated by high walls with the outside space. There were towers. The buildings didn't have an outdoor space. They had a courtyard, but in the yard there were animals, and there were, chariots and other things. But the Romans, they did have the house that was built to communicate with the outdoors, with gardening, which was not just growing food. It was also gardening to enjoy it aesthetically beautifully. And they loved it so much that even echoed it with the frescoes that I'm about to show you. And you can see the summer were also open gardens with exotic plants, fruit plants, plants that had an aesthetic and a moral value. They believed that the ultimate teaching of gardening and also farming, for what that matters, it's the fact that to be successful, you need to have discipline, you need to have knowledge, you need to pay attention, and that discipline that you need to achieve a good garden is also discipline that's good for your morals and for whatever you do in your life. So even though it's not an activity that has a practical end, because you do the garden just to enjoy the beauty of it, it has a very important moral consequences. So ultimately, this idea, of course, with some variation and differences and centuries, it's the ultimate idea that came from the Roman farmers ultimately, because it started with a farming manual, went through the Renaissance, as we will see again, and then it went all the way back to be picked up by an American farmer some 2,000 years later. And this is what I think it's so fascinating and so great about ideas that can transform and change and shape the future. And only a few gifted people have the talent to pick them up, because that was exactly what Olmsted picked up. The fact that the garden wasn't just a place that you just to make neatly and well groomed. It was a place that shaped your soul and shaped who you are and what the society can be. People there enjoying that space, enjoying that sharing of that aesthetic experience at different level, they realized in the end that we're all the same, because we all experience the space and of course the natural environment was the right place where to experience this fact that as humans we all share the same common baseline, and then we can start from that to build a better society. There's of course some mosaics with farming and winemaking. You see the winemakers, actually the Romans didn't make wine this way, they had wine presses, so they didn't make it by then. But anyway, natural activities and farming and gardening were a huge part. These are also celebrated in poetry. In the first century, the poet that celebrated Emperor Augustus, the power Augustus, so the beginning of the empire is the restoration of the values that Cato and their generation, the Republicans, basically, although it was changing the way the politics was carried out. And a deep element was the connection with nature and the fact that a golden age was about to come with empire, and this golden age was also seen in nature giving fruits without even having to invest too much in it. Anyway, the Bucolic and the Georgica basically are poems written by Virgil which is the same author of the Aeneas down at the bottom, which basically foster this connection, this spiritual and philosophical connection with nature, also in literature in the first century. For this is again Roman villas with Roman gardens, scenes of outdoors. These mosaics come from northern Africa, from Carthage, but basically it's the same. Consider this a second century AD. And then I'm about to wrap up. I just got a couple more bits. These are the frescoes representing a garden. So the Romans loved so much the garden that in the courtyard where there was a garden, they called peristylium because they had also hit the walkway with pillars. They were frescoes with plants and grass and birds around, just to basically amplify the effects, because you can never have enough. So to give this idea that for safety reason they needed to have a wall, but then they wanted to have it expanded. These are kept now in Rome in a museum in the Museo Nazionale Romano, right in the center of Rome, and they come from the villa of Livia. She was the empress, the wife of Emperor Augustus in the first century, and it's beautiful. And these are big because these are over 7 feet tall. So, and they're quite long. They're different legs, but they're over 30, 40 feet long. So when you go to their room to see this detached frescoes, it's really, really impressive. It feels like to be in the garden. The Roman villas that they could still be seen in Rome in the 1500s. They were the model for the very first villa surrounded by a garden, the suburban villa, a palace that was not in the city, surrounded by other walls, but outside the city in Rome, surrounded by beautiful gardens. And this one also had a shore on the river Tiber. This is the Villa Farnesina, was built at the beginning of 1500 in Rome by Raphael and Alessandro Peruzzi, Baldassare Peruzzi, sorry. And Raphael painted the beautiful frescoes with the ceiling, in which again, of course, they're gods. There's a lot. It's the Italian Renaissance, so there's a lot of naked people, a lot of naked women, because that's what Renaissance. I'm sorry, it's not about that, but there's a lot of that too. The enjoyment of human body. If God created the human body, that's what they taught in Renaissance. That's enjoyed. That's why when you travel to Italy, Europe, don't be surprised to see hundreds of naked people, even in the chapels, even in the churches, even the Catholic Church celebrated the male and the female nude bodies. And I have this is the 3D model, actually the 360 picture. This is today how the villa looks today. The palace was the first palace to be designed to have basically an open air loggia, basically a portico, columns that were open inside to the villa. So the indoors had to communicate with outdoors. The garden was actually coming in, and if they're going in, this is the rear, there's a bigger garden on the front. The garden today is a lot smaller than what it was, because in the 19th century, many buildings were built around. So they eat up most of the property. But anyway, the loggia, this was open, the glasses were only put about 100 years ago. And the windows, I mean, they were closed only later on. And then you could see that the ceiling that had the story of love and Psyche. So a lot of these figures are deities. That's Psyche, that's Juno, there's Venus here flying to the father Zeus, and so on. And then of course the gods feasting and dining. That's what you do in Rome, dying like a god. And you could see there are a number of plants and trees and even exotic ones. So melons, different species. There are over 100 different fruits and flowers and stuff. And there's a lot of attention. So this was frescoed by Raphael and his pupils. And in here, there's already the idea that being surrounded by nature, it's something that basically lifts up your souls. And that's what the whole idea of the story of love at Psyche is, like this beautiful woman that falls in love with the god love, but because she's a mortal, she's not allowed to love a god. So she have to do a number of deeds a number of tasks in order to prove that she's worthy of sitting with the gods. And she achieves that. So the meaning is, and this is Mercury announcing that she's being transported to that's here Psyche, transported to the Olympus to dine with the gods. That love is the fundamental transformational force in the universe. And of course, nature with all the fruits and the plants, it's also reflecting that message of love through the creation, to the beauty of the natural environment. So from this dialogue, from the outdoor space, the garden out here, of course, is a formal Italian gardens, and of course the celebration in culture and fresco, then we go all the way through basically from Renaissance Italy to France to England, 18th century. Then we arrive to Birkenhead Park. This is the plan that if you go to there is now a large visitor center, is a modern building where they give you a map and everything, and you can wander, and you can see there are different ponds, and there is all these bit different winding roads with a number of featured buildings. When the park opened to the public, there were over 10,000 people at the inauguration. At that time, maybe less than half of, maybe there were less than 20,000 people living in the area. So basically the place was swarmed because it was a large society. It was the first time that a borough had built a public park, which was built and funded by the public. So it was a sensational event, and opened in 1847, so just 3 years before Olmsted arrived and visited it. He actually, when he arrived, he didn't know about that. He was told, supposedly, that's what they say in the information center at the park, that had this story that he basically was told by a local baker in Liverpool when he arrived. It was saying, "Oh, but the British are really." There is this how do you call the base chat, the formal chat. The small talk. Do you have the small talk in America? Yeah. In Italy, for example, we don't do small talk. So my wife thinks I'm rude, but sometimes I tell people, look, I'm from a different place. We don't do the small talk. I'm kidding. And it's a way, to be nice, and it's, to overcome the awkwardness. But in Italy and Europe, it's really okay. It's okay if you don't speak to other people, and or you just say what you need. But here, how are you doing, you okay, and all that kind of very elaborate talking, which is also a way to allow different social classes and people with different backgrounds to integrate pretty well, because they all know they have to take to central routes. And so it was the baker who told him, "Oh, you're an architect from the garden farmer and a garden architect from America. You should visit this park," because everybody was basically on the news. And so he went down. It was really overwhelmed. This is the grand entrance, which of course is in the Italianate style, 1847. You can see the date at the top, and it has this Ionic column. So again, all this speaks the language of the Italian Renaissance, of the Roman architect. It's in the end, he's always there. The only thing that I would remove is the light. That the light standard is there, which is the modern addition. And this basically was the architectural features were designed by Lewin Hornblower, which was a British architect which mostly worked in the area, pretty local to Liverpool. He was born in Liverpool and educated in Liverpool. And it featured, of course, a Roman boathouse, because, of course, you have to have in the pond. Consider this area was a marshy area. What Paxson did, instead of just, using this land, was partially grazing land, partially, marshy area. He used some, 10 miles or more of pipes to get all the waters out and to, redrain and reshape. He shaped the hills, he shaped the winding roads. And there's really this very complex design in which you can actually mingle and you can share. And the thing that really, this is the Swiss bridge, the covered bridge. Is there there's a place in the US famous for the Madison County? Is that there's a movie about the bridges of Madison County? Apparently, yeah. Anyway, the covered bridges were common in Switzerland and in an alpine region, in places where you really need that. But in England, they became just a decorative feature, so they were designed, to be kind of a feature. But anyway, all this kind of curiosity, things to explore, and also things to talk about. And because the thing that really impressed Olmsted was the fact that he saw people of, as I said at the beginning, of different social levels, that you could see that the way they were dressed and the way they behaved, sitting next to each other and talking in the park. And they thought, this is how we can build a democracy. And this is the Esterford, I don't know how to call it, it's a pillar. It's basically to commemorate the Welsh art festival called Eisteddfod, that's Welsh, which means festival, basically. It's been held since the beginning of the first one was held in the 11 or 1200s, but since the 1800s, it's been held in different towns in Wales, and only 2 or 3 times the last 200 years it's been held somewhere else. 3 times. Once in Liverpool and once in the gardens, I think 1860 or 1870, because the gardens were so famous. The Will, it's outside of Wales. It's in England. It's just like 10 miles from the border, and another time in London. But other than that, it's always been held, and it's a very beautiful music festival where there are up to 5,000 musicians, choir members of choirs, singers, poets, and they do this ceremony of the chairing of the bard. The bard is the poet, and it's just the winner of this poetry contest is put on a chair with all the Welsh singing. There's a number of this celebration on YouTube. You can see this. Of course, it's the Rugby House with the cast iron, which are a feature of 19th century Corinthian columns, because of course you have to have Corinthian columns, and the slate roof. Slate is quoted in North Wales is another feature of the houses around here for roofing, and of course this design part, which is also made by Hornblower. And unfortunately, there isn't the greenhouses are not there anymore, but I have, as the last bit, a drone video with a musical surprise as well. I decided at the beginning of put a different music on this video, but I think I'm going to keep the original one. And the music I wanted to play was the Pastoral by Beethoven, because of course the pastoral idea of gardens was the idea that basically Olmsted had. Anyway, before playing the last video, if there are any, I went a little bit over time, but I hope that's okay. And if I have any questions, I'll like to take them. And if there's anybody who wants to ask or say something, and then I'll play the video. I'll just stop the sharing now so we can see the face, and then I'll play the sharing again, and we can.
So Mario, the aristocracy, how did it go? I didn't follow how did it get to the public people? I mean,
sorry, say it again.
How did the aristocracy and their personal private gardens finally get to?
So the idea was that these parks were gradually basically where it's more like a philosophical concept that the park was originally for only the exclusive use of the wealthy so even Paxton started to work for Cavendish, and then starting from already the 17th, 18th century, there were private and enterprise like the Vauxhall Gardens that opened them to the public for a ticket, and the public enjoyed them so much that then eventually they realized the benefit of the public, and hence were built. Now, I was going to do something more about the big villas in Europe, but those were mostly made by kings and then were later on open to the public. So they don't really fit this kind of idea of the development, which really took place in England, that originated as a private gardens in Europe, in France, and eventually they became something that for the public to enjoy in England, rather than, because in Europe they were made as early as 1870 or 1880. There were parks open to the public, but they were really only open to the nobility and people invited by them. If a commoner was walking there, they would grab him and knock him out.
So it sounds like they were using that as a way to fund the buildings and the estates to try to keep them going and open.
So now the thing is, from 1920s onwards, the families, they couldn't maintain most of those palaces and gardens and castles anymore. So the national trust, I see there's some questions here. Do you want to read them, Lila, or shall I read them? I can read them if you want.
Well,
go ahead. Yeah.
That kind of touches on one that came up, kind of asking how they're funded. Just the National Trust is funded by membership mostly, and they do fundraisings, events, like pretty much like most trusts. And there are, I'm not sure how much now, and there are some fundings available, but unavailable on projects like restoration projects. I think in that case they do have some state funding, but it's mostly privately managed and owned, and it doesn't basically depends on the government. There's a trustees, it is an independent trust. And
the membership, I can't remember how much it is, but it's not much, and you can enter to all these places. Most of these places, they have a ticket that ranges from £5 to £20. It depends, so from $10 to $30, something like that. Of course, then there are voluntary donation and events, but they did raise enough funds till the corona, as everybody who works in the entertainment industry, in the travel industry, anything that does with the public, knows that it has been basically a hard blow through every of these institutions. So I don't know what's the situation now. We are also members of the Chester Zoo, which is one of the oldest and most important zoos in England and in Europe. And basically, we are members of the zoo because they thought they would keep our kids for a while, but they said they couldn't. And I was very disappointed with the amount of money they charge for the membership. I'm sorry, no, I'm kidding. But well, and they were saying they were basically bankrupt, so they did a massive fundraising this winter, and they sent us things, say, please send more because we can't afford it. But because, of course, if you open to the public, you need the crowds, you need to be busy, reduce numbers, social distances. Yeah. If you're open to the public, you can't afford to, so let's hope we get over again. So, but usually they do get a lot of money. They have a lot of private donors, and they've done this for 200 years. They're very good at it now. So, funding and collecting money and things. Between admissions and membership and some others, there's my rental properties and bed and breakfast and the various stuff. Shop and tea room. Yeah, they have all sorts of things. I as I said, my wife thinks I'm rude when I always complain when we have to the cafes or the restaurants in these places, because the food is awful. I mean, one of the highlights of going to this place is like if you go to the Louvre in Paris, the food is fantastic. I mean, the service is horrible because the waiters are all French, so they hate you and they insult you and they look at you like you shouldn't be there. But the food is good and it's affordable. And well, in UK, no, you have like a dry bun with a hard sausage, and it's like £15. £5 for a bottle of still water that tastes worse than the tap water. Okay, I was thinking, okay, so I don't know if there are any other questions. Otherwise, I have the drone will go over the Birkenhead Park, and we'll see basically the things we're saying now.
Yeah, and I would just say, for those of you, when we look at Birkenhead Park, one thing that struck me was the curves, the transition from the kind of Italian French gardens that were very geometric. And Olmsted, I mean, it's one of his famous traits, is that he really liked the curves and kind of going around a corner and being surprised by what may be there, and to lead people on a winding path. So I definitely see the influence. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Okay, so I just plan to share this. I'll keep the music because I think it's a bit of...
There is a house in New Orleans they call the Rising Sun. And it's been the ruin of many a poor boy. And God, I know I'm one. My mother was a tailor. She sewed my new blue jeans. My father was a gambling man down in New Orleans. Now the only thing a gambler needs is a suitcase and trouble. And the only time he's satisfied is when drunk.
This is the boathouse, the Roman boathouse here. I'll go a little bit further.
It's a little scary.
So again,
I said that looks a little scary in there.
I don't think it's supposed to, but nobody have been there for 100 years. So there is a rugby club which is still active inside. There's some number of sport activities, but not the boats and the rowing part. I think it's too small this pond, but there would have been in the past. There's a lot of rowing on the River Dee and on the Mersey. It's the big rowing club. So that's the visitor center over there, which is a modern construct, and you can see it's pretty industrial around, and then you can see the still the industrial revolution kind of houses, you know, this kind of which where 90% of British live in those type of houses. We live in a house like that, and you know, with a little garden with the, you know, neighbors and stuff, and this is, yeah, you can see the winding parts and the ponds and the bridges. It is very beautiful. The only thing that probably you get 50 good days a year if you're lucky, because most of the time the weather is miserable. So, I mean, we're used to. I mean, I'm not very used to, but my kids are. So it rains, it snows, it's you know, it's terrible weather. It doesn't matter. They go out there, they play in the mud, in the rain, in the snow, and everything. And then there's Liverpool down there. It's a really big area.
Very industrial.
This is the, so here, these are the Albert Docks down here. This is the River Mersey, and down here, that's the Liver building. And that's the other cathedral. Liverpool has two cathedrals, Church of England, a Catholic one. There's the other cathedral over there. It's Liverpool also is a very beautiful city. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the talk. I don't know if you have any other questions, if you want to wrap this up. And next time you organize a group and you can come here and we can do a tour of Liverpool, Birkenhead Park, and Church Castle and part of the places in Wales, and then we can shoot off down to Paris and to Versailles and some French gardens, and then down to Florence to see the Medici villas and the Renaissance gardens. 2 weeks, start saving now, be wonderful. In a year or two.
The whole Conservancy is going to sign up, Layla.
Yeah, next time we'll get this in.
Group trip.
Trust me, it's worth